The folding chair had arrived 3 weeks late. That was the first thing I noticed when I walked into the council chamber for the very first time. Every other species had seats carved, bolted, grown, or crystallized directly into the tiered gallery of that enormous room. The Keth Dominion had thrones of compressed dark matter that hummed at a frequency you felt in your back teeth. The Thani delegation sat on something that looked like frozen smoke and somehow held their weight. The Orisai had what appeared to be living quartz formations shaped to cradle their multi-jointed frames. And then there was me, Ambassador Darian Akeo, representative of Earth, sitting in a chair that the Council's logistics department had shipped separately in a crate labeled Supplementary Furnishing, Minor Delegation, which had been held up at the station's intake dock because no one had thought to assign Earth a dock number. They gave us one eventually. Dock 117B. The same dock used for waste disposal and maintenance equipment. I sat in my chair, and I did not let my face do anything at all. The chamber itself was built inside a hollowed moon. That was not a metaphor. The Galactic Council had taken an actual moon, emptied it over the course of about 2 centuries, smoothed the interior into a perfect sphere, and carved 7 kilometers of terraced seating into the inner walls. The ceiling was the moon's far side, which they had thinned to translucency so that starlight came through in long, pale columns. It was, I will admit, one of the most beautiful things I had ever seen in my life. It was also designed in every structural and procedural detail to make certain species feel like furniture. There were 37 member species in the Galactic Council. Humanity had been admitted 11 months earlier, after a review process that had taken 19 years and required 2 separate votes because the first was deemed procedurally insufficient. The admission had passed on the second vote by a margin of 3. I had read the transcript of that vote on the transport ride over. The debate had lasted 11 hours. A delegate from the Orisai Continuum had argued that humanity's pattern of internal conflict relative to technological acceleration was a structural risk to galactic stability. The Keth advocate had seconded that concern. They had admitted us anyway. Not because they believed in us. Because the vote math worked out and there was a procedural deadline they did not want to miss. I knew all of this before I sat down in my late-arriving chair. My protocol handler was a Thani named Sorrel. The Thani were tall, narrow-shouldered creatures with semi-translucent skin through which you could see the faint movement of their circulatory system, pale blue and slow. They communicated in 2 registers simultaneously. Spoken language, and a complex system of fin movements along their jaw and collar that carried emotional and tonal content the spoken words left out. Learning to read the fins was not part of any standard diplomatic training package. I had spent 5 months learning anyway. Sorrel found me in the gallery corridor before the first session opened. His fins moved in a slow, flattened pattern I had catalogued as bureaucratic resignation, the Thani equivalent of someone sighing before they explained something obvious to someone who would not understand. Ambassador Akeo, he said, I have been assigned to assist your delegation with procedural orientation. I appreciate that. The Council operates on a seniority-weighted participation model. Species admitted within the last 50 years are extended observer status with limited floor access. You may submit written queries through the Tier 4 filing system. Response times average between 30 and 90 standard days. And verbal participation? The fins shifted. Something between amusement and pity. You will not be addressed in session. It is not protocol. I understand the protocol, I said. He looked at me for a moment with the particular stillness of someone who has just realized the person they are talking to did not find that discouraging and is not sure what to do with that. The first session begins in 47 minutes. The primary item on the agenda is a resource reallocation bill submitted by the Keth Dominion. He handed me a data tablet and walked away. The fins, as he turned, made a movement I had not catalogued before. Something small and quick. I filed it away. I sat back down in my chair and opened the bill. It was 389 pages long. The Keth Dominion's Resource Management and Sustainability Act, Version 9, Revision 3. The language was dense, careful, and precise in the way that very well-designed traps are precise. On the surface, it was an environmental protection framework. It cited 16 geological surveys, 3 pangalactic ecological indices, and a landmark ruling from 300 years ago that had established mineral extraction quotas in the outer belt regions. On the surface, it looked like conservation. The session started. Speakers rose and spoke in languages my earpiece translated with a half-second delay. I kept reading. My coffee went cold. A Keth delegate delivered a 30-minute presentation with holographic mapping overlays that made the bill look like humanitarian work. I kept reading. The chamber voted on a secondary agenda item. Voted again. The light through the thin ceiling shifted as the station moved through its orbital position. My coffee was cold enough now that I stopped noticing it was there. And then I found it. Subsection 12, Appendix B, Footnote 7. It was 9 lines long. Written in a subordinate clause construction that made it read like an administrative clarification rather than a substantive provision. It redefined the threshold criteria for biological sustainability review in a way that quietly, technically, and completely legally excluded any species admitted within the last 40 standard years from the asteroid belt claim protections that the main body of the bill was pretending to guarantee. 5 species fell inside that window. Earth was one of them. I closed the data tablet. I set it down on my knee with care. The chamber continued around me, enormous and humming with the procedural machinery of civilizations that had been doing this for longer than humanity had written language. I looked at my cold coffee. Then I looked at the 9 lines again. I had come here expecting to be furniture. That was fine. Furniture could be moved. Furniture could be rearranged. Furniture, if you were paying attention, told you everything about how a room was designed to work and who it was designed to work for. I had 389 pages of information. Now I had one footnote that mattered. I had a session schedule showing the bill was moving to final vote in 11 days. 11 days was enough. I picked up my coffee, cold as it was, and drank it anyway. Then I opened a new file on my tablet and started writing. The first thing I did the next morning was attend a subcommittee session that had nothing to do with the Keth bill. Sorrel found me there during the recess interval, standing in the back row of a gallery that held maybe 20 delegates and had clearly not expected a human in it at any point. He looked at me the way you look at someone who has shown up to a party that was not for them. "This is the Infrastructure Subcommittee on Inner Belt Transit Corridors," he said. "I know. It is not relevant to Earth's current procedural standing." "I'm curious about the process," I said. The Finns did the thing I had begun privately calling the resigned flutter. He left. I stayed. I attended 4 more sessions that day. A resource classification hearing. A dispute arbitration preliminary. A procedural review committee that spent 3 hours discussing the proper formatting requirements for Tier 2 filings. I took notes on all of it. Not because any of it was directly useful. Because I was starting to understand that the Council's power did not live in its votes. It lived in its procedures. And procedures, unlike power, could be learned. That night, I sent a message back to my analyst on Earth, a woman named Dr. Mira Voss, who had been working interstellar policy for 14 years and who communicated almost entirely in terse, accurate sentences. The message read, "I need everything we have on the Council's founding charter. Original text. Every available translation cross-referenced against current standing rules." Her reply came back 7 hours later, accounting for transmission delay. That document is 4,300 years old and has never been formally translated into any post-30th century admission language because the Council has never provided one. I know. Send what exists. Another 7 hours. Then, sending. Also, are you sleeping? I looked at my open files. There were 22 of them. I had color-coded the subsections of the Keth bill in 5 different categories. I had a running document of procedural cross-references that had grown to 47 pages. My bunk light was still on. "Enough," I wrote back. Which was not entirely accurate, but was accurate enough. The founding charter arrived in fragments. Partial translations done by 4 different academic institutions over 5 centuries. None of them complete. None of them agreeing on certain key passages. Several of them flagging sections that had been deliberately left untranslated in the official Council archives. That last detail I filed very carefully. Deliberately left untranslated, in a document that was still the binding legal framework for every rule the Council had ever written. I started with the sections that had been translated. Cross-referenced them against current standing rules. Built a map of what the current rules cited versus what the founding charter actually said. There were gaps. Not errors exactly. More like rooms in a house that had been quietly sealed off and painted over. You would only notice if you were looking for the original floor plan. I was looking for the original floor plan. On day 3, Voss sent another message without my asking. I showed your cross-reference document to our senior legal advisor. She said, and I am quoting directly, "This is the most aggressively organized act of legal research I have seen in 35 years of practice." She also said you should sleep. I sent back a single word, "Later." By day 5, I had identified the mechanism. Statute 17 of the Founding Charter. It had never been cited in any session in recorded council history, at least not in any session whose transcript was publicly available. It existed in the original text. It was referenced in 2 of the 4 partial translations. And it had been quietly excluded from the Standing Rules Index that new member species received upon admission. You had to know to look for it. You had to know what you were looking for when you found it. Any signatory species may invoke a full charter compliance review before any bill affecting biological sustainability reaches final vote. During the review period, the bill is frozen. The review cannot be waived by procedural countermotion without a unanimous founding member vote. A unanimous founding member vote had not happened in the Council's entire history. The founding members had not agreed unanimously on anything since the original signing. The Keth had helped write that clause. Back when they were the emerging species. Back when the old powers of that era had been trying to do to them exactly what they were now doing to 5 smaller species through 9 lines in a footnote. They had written the lock. They had forgotten they wrote it. Or they had assumed no one would ever find it. I filed the invocation form on day 6. The form number was so old that the Council's digital filing system initially returned an error message stating that the form type was not recognized. I sent a written inquiry to the administrative office. The response came back 22 hours later, from a junior Thani clerk who had apparently needed to contact 4 separate archive departments to confirm that yes, the form was real, and yes, the system would accept it, and could I please resubmit with a legacy document header. I resubmitted with the legacy document header. The system accepted it. The filing confirmation arrived with no flags, no alerts, no notifications sent to any senior council official. It sat in a processing queue managed by a clerk who was on ceremonial leave. The queue was not monitored by anyone else. I told Voss. Her reply, "How long until someone notices?" My reply, Session 41. When I stand up. The day of the vote arrived. Session 41 opened at the second standard hour. The chamber was at less than half capacity. The Keth had sent their third-tier advocate. The Orisai had sent 2 junior delegates. The Thani senior delegate was present, but had the body language of someone completing a formality before a longer meeting elsewhere. The first item on the agenda was a transit corridor naming dispute that took 35 minutes and resolved without incident. Then the presiding officer, Elder Soren of the Thani founding delegation, called the second item. The Keth Resource Management Act, Version 9, Revision 3. Final vote. I stood up. The room did not go quiet immediately. It took about 4 seconds for the people nearest to me to register what was happening and pass that registration outward through the chamber like a slow ripple. Soren looked at me with the expression of someone who has encountered a procedural situation they were not briefed on and is deciding in real time how to respond. The chair recognizes. He paused, glanced at his notes, clearly searching for words he had never expected to say. The delegate from Earth. I had practiced the pronunciation of Statute 17's invocation language from the original founding charter text for 3 days. My accent was almost certainly terrible. I said the words anyway, clearly, at a pace that did not rush or stumble. The Keth third-tier advocate turned around in his seat. His membrane went from standard dark gray to the color of a thunderstorm that has just realized it is indoors. "Objection," he said. The referenced statute has not been active in standing practice for over 900 standard years. Invocation requires demonstrated relevance under current procedural guidelines. He cited Section 22, subsection 4 smoothly. I had read that section 17 times. Section 22, subsection 4 applies to statutes introduced after the charter ratification date, I said. Statute 17 predates it. Under the charter's own hierarchy clause, original statutes are not subject to amendment procedures applied to post-ratification rules. They stand unless removed by unanimous founding member vote. The last unanimous founding member vote had been at the original signing. I did not say that out loud. I did not need to. The Keth advocate cited a second precedent. I cited back. He cited a third. I had read that one too. Soren called a 10-minute recess after the 8th exchange. That was the first time in the Council's observable history that a Tier 4 minor species delegate had held a floor argument past the third citation. In the recess corridor, the light was cooler and the acoustics were flatter, and I could hear my own heartbeat in a way I could not in the chamber. I stood near the far wall and drank water and looked at nothing in particular. The Keth advocate crossed the corridor toward me. He did not have his legal team with him. He was alone. And without the chamber's ambient sound, the color shifts in his membrane were slower, less performed. He stopped a reasonable distance away and looked at me with something I had not seen from any Keth representative in any session I had attended. "How long," he said, "did you spend preparing this?" It was not an aggressive question. It was a real one. 12 days, I said. He was quiet. The membrane shifted through a slow sequence I did not have a reference for. Not thunderstorm. Not the formal gray. Something in between. "No member species," he said finally, "has ever invoked that statute." "I know. It was not in your admission materials." "No." "Then how did you find it?" I looked at him for a moment. He was the third-tier advocate, not the lead. He had been sent here because this was supposed to be a formality. He had shown up expecting a vote and gotten something else entirely. And he was asking me a genuine question in an empty corridor because something about the situation had stripped the performance out of him. "I read everything," I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he went back into the chamber without another word. The recess ended. The arguments resumed. By the time Soren called the session close, the Keth bill was frozen, pending a full charter compliance review that would take at minimum 90 standard days. The vote did not happen. I walked back to my late-arriving chair and sat down and put my hands in my lap where no one could see them shaking. The compliance review took 94 days. I spent most of them in the archive wing of the station, a place that smelled of filtered air and something faintly metallic, where the physical records of 4,300 years of council proceedings were stored in formats ranging from crystalline data lattices to handwritten documents sealed in atmospheric preservation cases. I had requested access to the archive on day 2 of my posting. I had been told access was available to all member delegations. No one had ever specified that minor status delegations were excluded, possibly because no minor status delegation had ever asked. Voss sent me a message on day 15 of the review. 3 other species have filed procedural objections to unrelated bills in the last week using the same statute. I wrote back, "I know. I did know." Sorrel had told me in his way, by arriving at the archive wing on day 12 with a secondary data tablet and sitting 3 seats away from me without speaking. Thani Protocol made direct acknowledgement of an action they found significant into something they communicated through proximity instead. He sat with me for 3 hours. Then he left. The fins as he walked out made the movement I had seen twice before and had by then catalogued. He had not expected me. On day 45, the Keth lead advocate, the actual lead this time, not the third tier, requested a formal meeting with me through the proper Tier 4 filing channels. Response time on my queries was supposed to average 30 to 90 days. His request came back approved in 5 hours. We met in a conference room that was neutral space. Neither Keth nor Thani design. Just a table and chairs, and the ambient hum of the station's environmental systems. He was larger than the third-tier advocate. Older. And the color shifts in his membrane were controlled in the way that long practice makes controlled. You could still read them if you knew how to look. He sat down across from me and folded his hands on the table. "I want to understand something," he said. "Not as a procedural matter. As a question between delegates." "Ask it." "The clause you invoked. You know its origin?" "Yes." "You know who wrote it?" "Yes." He watched me. The membrane held a slow, dark color I had come to associate with Keth formality. But underneath it something moved. Small. Harder to name. "We wrote it to protect ourselves," he said. I know that too. And you used it against us. I looked at him for a moment. I used it to protect 5 species whose sustainability claims were being removed through language buried in a footnote. One of those species is mine. The other 4 aren't. He was quiet. Your species has been a member for 11 months, he said. 10 months and 29 days. But the charter doesn't have a residency requirement for statute invocation. Any signatory species. That's what it says. Another silence. The membrane shifted. He looked at the table for a moment and then back at me. The bill will not pass as written, he said. The Keth Dominion is prepared to submit a revised version that removes the contested provisions from the footnote. I waited. In exchange, he said, the compliance review is withdrawn, and no further charter-based challenges are filed against Keth legislative items for a period of 20 standard years. I had expected something like this. I had also prepared for something like this. The compliance review cannot be withdrawn by the invoking party alone under the statute, I said. It requires a procedural close motion that goes back to the full chamber. I can support that motion. I cannot guarantee others will. Because by that point, I could not guarantee that the 4 other species who had filed their own objections had their own timelines and their own reasons and their own relationship to the founding charter that was no longer mine to manage. He looked at me. You understand what you have started? It was not hostile. It was something closer to honest. I understand what 11 months of reading started, I said. He stood. He straightened his formal outer layer and looked at me one more time. The membrane went, for just a moment, entirely still. No performance. No diplomacy. Just a long, level look from a species that had been powerful for a very long time, watching something change in front of them. Then he left. The room was quiet. I sat at the table alone for a few minutes before I went back to the archive. 94 days. Then came Session 68. The revised Keth Bill, stripped of footnote 7 and its 9 lines, was scheduled for final vote. The chamber was at full capacity for the first time since I had arrived. Every senior delegate present. Every seat filled. The Keth took their dark matter thrones. The Orisai took their living quartz formations. I took my chair. The vote passed. The asteroid belt claims for all 5 emerging species were preserved. Soren closed the session with the standard procedural language he had used to close every session I had attended. Nothing in his tone was different. Nothing in the chamber's official record marked that session as anything other than a routine administrative vote. But the chamber, as it emptied, felt different. Not louder. Not more celebratory. Different in the way a room feels different when the furniture has been rearranged, and you cannot immediately identify which piece moved, but you know something has. I gathered my things. I folded my notes. I looked at my chair, which had arrived late in a crate labeled supplementary furnishing, and I thought about the dock number borrowed from a waste disposal bay, and the vote that had passed by 3, and 11 months of everyone in this room assuming I had nothing to say. Then I walked out into the corridor and called Voss. She picked up after 1 ring, which meant she had been waiting. Well, she said. Well, I said. A pause. Then, in the tone of a woman who had spent 14 years in interstellar policy and had learned to keep her voice level for most things, Darian, you understand this changes things. That's the idea, I said. She was quiet for a moment. The 4 other species who filed parallel objections want to request a meeting. I know. Set it up. Another pause. The Fanny senior delegate submitted a formal inquiry to the administrative office this morning. He asked whether the Charter's founding language archive has a public access policy for member delegations. He submitted it himself. Not through a junior staffer. His personal filing signature. I stopped walking. He submitted it himself. His personal filing signature, Voss repeated. The senior delegate. I stood in the corridor and looked at nothing. The station hummed around me. The light through distant viewports was the pale blue-white of starlight filtered through reinforced material. Okay, I said finally. Okay, Voss said. And Darian, please sleep. I will, I said. And this time, I meant it. 3 months after Session 68, my formal posting review came through. The Council's administrative office had created a new role. It had a title that ran to 53 words in standard Galactic Common and translated into English as something roughly approximating Founding Charter Compliance and Member Equity Officer, which was either a promotion or a polite way of putting me in a room where they could watch me. Possibly both. I accepted it. My new chair was bolted to the floor. No one made an announcement about that. No memo was circulated. One morning I came into the chamber and the folding chair was gone, and a fixed installation was in its place, flush with the gallery floor, labeled with Earth's delegation marker in the same style as every other senior seat in the chamber. Sorrel was in the corridor when I arrived that morning. He looked at me. His fins made the movement I now knew well, the one I had catalogued on day one and spent weeks identifying. The Fanny expression for "I did not expect you." "Sorrel," I said. "Thank you for everything." He looked at the middle distance for a moment in the way Fanny do when they are deciding how much of an emotional response is appropriate. Then his fins moved again, something smaller, quicker, something I had not catalogued before but understood anyway. "I think it meant I'm glad I was wrong about you." He walked away before I had to find words for it. I was grateful for that. The new session was 3 days away. A different bill this time, submitted by the Orosai Continuum, concerning atmospheric management rights over a cluster of pre-mission worlds. The language was careful and precise, and on page 312 of 428 contained a provision that quietly reclassified 3 inhabited worlds as uninhabited for developmental purposes, based on a population threshold that had been set specifically low enough to exclude the species currently living there. I had read it twice. Then I had read it again. Then I had gone to the archive. The archive wing was quiet at this hour. The filtration systems hummed in their steady, metallic rhythm. Crystal data lattices glowed softly in their preservation cases. I had spent so many hours here that the archive keepers, a quiet, elderly Fanny and his assistant, had stopped asking what I was looking for. They just nodded when I arrived and left me to the stacks. I pulled the Orosai Bill's legislative history. It had taken me 6 hours to find the right cross-references. The Council's filing system was not designed for transparency. It was designed for permanence, for storing records, not for retrieving them. But permanence meant everything was still there. Every draft. Every revision. Every internal memo that had been attached to the file and never removed. The population threshold had been changed 3 times in the bill's drafting history. Each change had lowered the number. The original threshold, from the first draft filed 14 months ago, would have protected all 3 inhabited worlds. The final threshold, buried in the version now scheduled for vote, protected none of them. There was no explanation for the changes in the public record. No justification. No environmental impact statement. Just the numbers, quietly revised, quietly filed, quietly moved forward. I copied the entire drafting history to my personal data tablet. Then I went back to my quarters and started building a new file. Session 72 opened on a clear day, station time. Full attendance again, which was becoming a pattern. I took my bolted-down seat and set my files in order and waited. Across the gallery, in the back row, I could see a delegate from a species whose name I had learned to pronounce over the past 2 weeks. They had been admitted to the Council 6 months ago. Their seat was a temporary installation, 2 steps up from the gallery floor. And from where I was sitting, I could see that they were holding a data tablet. The tablet was open to the Orosai Bill. They were reading it the way I had read the Keth Bill, with the kind of stillness that means you have stopped noticing the room around you. I watched them for a moment. Then I pulled my session notes from my file. My notes for that session were thorough, carefully cross-referenced. They included every statutory citation that would be relevant to a challenge under Statute 17 of the Founding Charter, including the correct pronunciation of the invocation language, which I had annotated phonetically in the margin. I made a second copy. I crossed the gallery during the opening procedural statements, when the room's attention was on Soren and the transit corridor dispute that opened the agenda. I set the second copy of my notes on the railing beside the new delegate's seat. Without a word, they looked at the notes. Then they looked at me. I did not explain anything. I went back to my seat. Because some things you do not explain. You find the clause buried in the footnote. You learn the words. You stand up in the room where no one expects you to speak, and you speak anyway. And then, If you are paying attention, you look around and you see who else in that room has been reading while everyone assumed they were just sitting quietly in a temporary chair. And you hand them the map. Soren called the second agenda item the Orisai Bill. I waited. Across the gallery, the new delegate did not stand. Not yet. But they were reading my notes. I could see their eyes moving across the pages. The invocation language. The statutory citations. The cross-references to the drafting history that I had painstakingly reconstructed from the archive. On page 4 of my notes, I had written something that was not a legal citation. It was a question. 3 words, handwritten in the margin. Do you see it? The delegate looked up. Across the gallery, our eyes met. Then they looked back down at the notes. And their hand, resting on the railing beside their temporary chair, moved in a small, deliberate way. A single finger tap. Yes. I turned back to my own tablet. The Orisai delegate was speaking now, a long, careful presentation about environmental protection and sustainable development. The chamber listened with the polite attention of beings who had heard similar presentations hundreds of times before. I opened a new file on my tablet. I typed 3 words. Not the invocation. Not yet. Something else. Wait for my signal. I sent it through the Council's internal messaging system. The channel was supposed to be for procedural communications only. No one had ever specified that minor delegation members could not message each other directly. Possibly because no minor delegation had ever tried. A few seconds later, a reply appeared on my screen. Waiting. I closed the message and looked up. The Orisai delegate was finishing their presentation. Soren opened the floor for questions. No one spoke. The bill moved toward final vote. I stood up. The room did not go quiet immediately. It took about 3 seconds this time. The chamber had learned faster than I expected. Soren looked at me. His expression was different now than it had been during the Keth session. Not surprised. Measuring. The chair recognizes the delegate from Earth. I turned to face the gallery. Not the presiding officer. Not the Keth delegation. The back row. The temporary seats. The delegates who had been admitted in the last decade and given folding chairs and waste disposal bay dock numbers. The delegate from Earth yields time, I said, to the delegate from the Tellus Concord. A ripple went through the chamber. The Keth advocate's membrane shifted colors rapidly. The Orisai delegate's assistant dropped a data tablet. In the back row, the new delegate stood up. Their voice was quiet at first. Uncertain. Then it steadied. They spoke the invocation language from my notes. Their accent was worse than mine had been. It did not matter. The words were the same words. The statute was the same statute. The footnote was the same footnote, reappearing in a different bill, written by a different species, aimed at different worlds. But the mechanism was identical. Soren called a recess. The Orisai bill froze. The chamber erupted into the kind of controlled chaos that only beings who have spent millennia perfecting procedural warfare can produce. I sat back down in my bolted chair. Across the gallery, the Tellus delegate was being surrounded by their suddenly attentive protocol handler. Their hands were shaking. Their voice, when they spoke to the handler, was still steady. I sent another message. Well done. A reply came back. 3 words. I read everything. I smiled. Not because anything was funny. Because Session 72 had just changed what the Council's floor looked like. Not loudly. Not with announcements. Just the slow structural shift of a room where new people had started reading the original floor plan. And finding all the sealed-off doors. The Tellus Concord's invocation froze the Orisai bill for 90 days. During that time, 4 more species filed objections under Statute 17. Each one had found a different clause buried in a different footnote, hidden in a different bill. The mechanism was always the same. Write a law that looked like protection. Bury an exclusion in a subordinate clause. Assume no one would read far enough to notice. People were reading now. The archive wing, which had been empty for decades, suddenly had a regular afternoon crowd. Junior delegates from 7 species sat at the long tables, working through founding charter translations, cross-referencing standing rules, building their own files. The elderly Thani keeper had to hire an assistant. The assistant had to hire an assistant. Sorrel found me in the corridor after session 91. The Orisai bill had been revised, stripped of its hidden clause, and passed into law. The Tellus delegate had received a formal commendation from their home government. They had also received a death threat from an unknown source, which the station security office was investigating. The delegate had not left their quarters for 3 days. I knew this because I had been bringing them meals. The station's food dispensers were adequate but not comforting. I had learned to make a particular kind of soup in my small kitchen unit, the same soup my mother made when I was sick as a child. The Tellus delegate, whose name was Sen, said it reminded them of something their grandmother used to cook. Sorrel did not mention any of this. He stood in the corridor with his hands clasped behind his back, and his fins held in a pattern I had learned to recognize as deliberate neutrality. "The administrative office has received a petition," he said, "signed by 12 member species. It requests a full review of the Council's founding charter and all subsequent amendments for procedural consistency." I waited. Elder Soren has approved the review. It will begin next session cycle. The review will be conducted by a committee composed of representatives from each signatory species, including Earth. The petition lists Earth as the 13th signatory. Your filing signature was added this morning. I assumed you would want to know. I looked at him. His fins flickered, something small and quick. The expression I had come to think of as I am not supposed to show approval, but I am showing it anyway. "Thank you, Sorrel," I said. He nodded once and walked away. His cane tapped on the polished floor. He was old, older than he looked, older than the station, older than most of the species who sat in the chamber. He had been here for centuries, watching delegations come and go, watching minor species sit in temporary chairs and say nothing. He had not expected me. I was starting to understand that he had been waiting for someone like me for a very long time. The Charter Review Committee held its first session on a cold morning, station time. The chamber was different today. Not the grand chamber, with its terrace seating and starlight ceiling. A smaller room. More intimate. The same room where the founding members had signed the original document 4,300 years ago. The walls were made of something that looked like dark glass. Embedded in the glass were the original signatures, etched in light, still glowing after all this time. Each signature was written in a different language. Some of the scripts had no living speakers left. But the light had not faded. 13 species sat around a circular table. No thrones. No frozen smoke. No living quartz. Just chairs. All of them the same height. All of them bolted to the floor at the same distance from the center. I sat between the Tellus delegate and a representative from a species called the Veth, small, soft-furred beings who had been admitted to the Council 9 months ago and had already filed 2 charter objections of their own. They were learning fast. Soren opened the session. He spoke in Galactic Standard, then in Thani, then in a third language I did not recognize. The translation earpieces hummed. "The purpose of this review," he said, "is not to revise the charter. The purpose is to understand it, to read what was written, to ask what has been added, and what has been removed, and by whose authority." He paused. His ancient eyes moved across the table, pausing for a moment on each face. These questions should have been asked before. They were not. They will be asked now. The session lasted 8 hours. We broke for lunch, real food, brought in from the station's diplomatic mess. Sen and I ate together in a small alcove off the main corridor. They had stopped shaking. Their voice was steady. They asked me about Earth, about the ocean, about the soup I had made for them. "My grandmother," they said, "used to say that people who feed you are people who will protect you." I did not believe her until now. I did not know what to say to that. So I said nothing. I just sat with them in the quiet, and ate my lunch, and thought about how strange it was to be here. In a room older than human civilization. Surrounded by beings who had once looked at Earth and seen nothing worth paying attention to. And now they were reading our filings. Citing our precedent. Asking us questions about procedure and interpretation. Furniture, I thought. That's what they expected. Furniture doesn't move. Furniture doesn't speak. Furniture doesn't hand you a map and show you where the doors are. I looked at Senator. They were reading something on their data tablet. Probably the next bill, the next hidden clause, the next footnote. They had learned fast. They would learn faster. I stood up. I need to make a call. Sen nodded without looking up. Tell your mother I said hello. I smiled. I will. The corridor was empty. The station hummed its quiet, steady hum. I pulled out my personal communicator and called home. My mother answered on the second ring. Darian. It is very early here. I know, Mama. I'm sorry. I just wanted to hear your voice. A pause. Then softer. What is wrong? Nothing is wrong. Everything is right. I think. I leaned against the wall. Mama, do you remember when I told you I was going to work on the moon? You said it was temporary. You said you would be home in 6 months. That was 2 years ago. I know. I'm sorry. Stop apologizing. Are you eating? Yes, Mama. Proper food. Sen made me soup. It was good. A long pause. Who is Sen? A colleague. From a different star. Another pause. Longer this time. Then my mother laughed, the particular laugh she used when she had decided to stop worrying and start trusting. You are having adventures, she said. Your father always said you would. He would be proud. I closed my eyes. Thank you, Mama. Come home when you can. The jollof will be waiting. I promise. She hung up. I stood in the corridor for a while longer, looking at nothing. The station hummed. The light through the viewports was the pale blue-white of distant stars. Then I went back to the committee room. The session was restarting. Sen was already seated. The Veth delegate was reading something aloud in their soft, careful voice. Soren was listening with his ancient eyes half closed. I took my seat. The chair was bolted to the floor. The same height as every other chair. At the same distance from the center. I opened my files. The next bill was already waiting. 407 pages. I started reading. Somewhere in the distance, through the translucence of the moon's far side, a star was rising. Not the sun. Not Earth's sun. A different sun, in a different system, light that had traveled for centuries to reach this place. I thought about the folding chair. The late-arriving chair. The crate labeled supplementary furnishing. The dock number borrowed from a waste disposal bay. The vote that had passed by 3. The first time I stood up in a room where no one expected me to speak. And I thought about the 3 words that had changed everything. Not the invocation. Not the legal formula. The other 3 words. The ones I had written in the margin of my notes, handed to a stranger in a temporary seat, hoping they would understand. Do you see it? They had seen it. They had stood up. They had spoken. And now the room was different. Not louder. Not more celebratory. Just different in the way a room becomes different when the furniture starts moving on its own. I turned to page 1. The chamber hummed. I started reading. 1 year after the Charter Review Committee first convened, the Council held a formal session to acknowledge the review's completion. The chamber was full. Every seat occupied. Every delegation present. Not because the agenda required it, the agenda was ceremonial, but because no one wanted to miss what happened next. The review had produced 17 recommendations. None of them were radical. They clarified the hierarchy of statutes. They restored the full text of the founding charter to the Standing Rules Index. They established a public archive access policy for all member delegations, regardless of admission date. Small changes. Technical changes. The kind of changes that look like nothing unless you know what was missing before. I sat in my bolted chair and watched the vote. It passed unanimously. For the first time in the Council's recorded history, every founding member voted the same way on a substantive procedural matter. After the session, Sun found me in the corridor. They had grown taller, or perhaps they simply stood straighter now. Their delegation had been moved from the back row to the middle tier. Their temporary chair had been replaced with a permanent installation, though not yet bolted. That would come. You are leaving, they said. Not a question. Soon. My posting ends next week. They offered you an extension. They did. And you refused. I have been away for 2 years. My mother is waiting. She promised to make jollof. San was quiet for a moment. Then they said something I did not expect. I will miss you. I looked at them. Their species did not express emotion the same way humans did. But I had learned to read the small movements, the angle of their head, the stillness of their hands, the particular way they held their data tablet when they were not sure what to say. I will miss you too, I said. But you do not need me anymore. I know. They looked down at their tablet. That is strange. I was so afraid, the first time. Standing up. Speaking the words. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the notes. I know. Mine were too. You hid it well. I had practice. I paused. You will hide it well too. Eventually. But do not hide it completely. The shaking matters. It means you understand what you are risking. Sen nodded slowly. The Veth delegate asked me to help them prepare a challenge. For the next bill. The one about the outer belt mining rights. Are you going to help them? Yes. They looked at me. That is what we do now. Help each other. I smiled. Yes. That is what you do now. We stood in the corridor for a while longer, not speaking. The station hummed. The light through the viewports was the pale blue-white of distant stars. Somewhere below us, the archive wing was full of junior delegates reading founding charter translations. The elderly Thani keeper had hired a third assistant. The queue for table space was now 3 days long. One more thing, Sen said. The Council Administrative Office released a statement this morning. They have updated the official designation of Earth from Minor Member, Tier 4, to Full Member, Tier 2. I had not heard this. When did this happen? The vote was last night. The motion was submitted by the Keth Dominion. I stared at them. The Keth Dominion submitted a motion to raise Earth status. The motion was seconded by the Orosai Continuum. The vote was unanimous. The corridor felt very quiet. I thought about the Keth advocate in the conference room. You understand what you have started. I thought about the Orosai delegate whose assistant had dropped a data tablet when Sun stood up. I thought about the third-tier advocate who had crossed an empty corridor to ask me a genuine question, stripped of performance, stripped of protocol, just one being to another. Full member, Tier 2, I said. Your chair will be moved to the upper gallery. You will have a new chair. A better one, I think. I liked my chair. Sun made a sound that might have been a laugh. You would. My last day on the station. I woke early, before the shift lights came on, and went to the Grand Chamber one final time. The chamber was empty. The terraced seating rose in silent tiers. The starlight ceiling glowed with the slow light of a distant sun. I walked to the upper gallery. Found my chair. It had been moved, bolted into place among the other Tier 2 seats. The metal was warm, as if someone had been sitting in it recently. Perhaps they had. Perhaps the council had tested the chair before I arrived, to make sure it was level with the others, to make sure it did not wobble, to make sure it belonged here. I sat down. The chair held me the way it was supposed to. Not higher than the others. Not lower. The same height. The same distance from the center. I thought about the folding chair that had arrived 4 weeks late. The crate labeled supplementary furnishing. The dock number borrowed from a waste disposal bay. The vote that had passed by 3. The first time I stood up, in a room where no one expected me to speak, and said words I had practiced in the dark. I thought about the footnote. The 9 lines written in a subordinate clause. The mechanism buried in procedure. The lock that had been designed to keep emerging species out, and the key that had been left in the lock by the people who built it, because they had needed it once too. We wrote it to protect ourselves. And then they forgot. Or they assumed no one would ever read far enough to find it. I had read far enough. I sat in the quiet chamber for a long time, not moving, not thinking about anything in particular. Just breathing. Just listening to the hum of the station. Just watching the light shift through the thin ceiling as the moon moved through its orbit. Then I stood up. I walked out of the grand chamber. I walked through the corridors, past the archive wing, past the committee rooms, past the dock where my ship was waiting. The station hummed. The light was pale and steady. At the airlock, I turned back. Not because I was looking for anything. Just because I wanted to see it one more time. The long corridor stretching behind me, empty now, but not the way it had been when I arrived. Then, it had felt like a place I was passing through. Now, it felt like a place I had helped build. Not built. Not yet. Started. The foundation laid. The floor plan uncovered. The sealed doors opened. Sin would finish the rest. And the Veth. And the others, the ones who were still reading, still learning, still standing up in rooms where no one expected them to speak. They would find their own footnotes. Their own clauses. Their own 3 words. Do you see it? I turned and walked through the airlock. The ship was small and quiet, like the one I had arrived in. My seat was still in the same place. I sat down and strapped in and pulled up the communication console. A message from Voss. The Charter Review Committee's final report has been translated into English. It is 847 pages long. I have printed a copy for your mother. She asked me to tell you that the jollof is ready. I laughed. Actually laughed. It felt strange, like testing a muscle I had not used in a long time. I sent a reply. On my way. Then I leaned back in my seat and closed my eyes. The engines hummed. The ship pulled away from the station. Through the viewport, I watched the moon grow smaller, the hollowed moon, the chamber inside it, the starlight ceiling, the bolted chairs, the archive where I had spent so many hours reading documents written in languages older than my species. I thought about the delegate who had asked me, in an empty corridor, how I had found the clause. I read everything. That was the answer. That was always the answer. Not brilliance. Not luck. Just reading. Just paying attention. Just refusing to stop when the document got long and the language got dense and the room got quiet. The ship jumped to fold space. The stars stretched into lines of light. Somewhere behind me, the station was receding into the dark. Somewhere ahead of me, Earth was waiting. And somewhere in between, in a room carved into a hollowed moon, a delegate from a species called the Tellus Concord was reading the next bill. Finding the next footnote. Preparing the next words. They did not need me anymore. That was the point. I smiled. The ship hummed. The stars held their light. And I went home.